Baltic Sea is now completely surrounded by NATO members. Putin is now completely cut off. Any attack on Finland is now an attack on NATO, a far harder proposition. As Russia continues to wage its war of terror and to push European security to its limit, a fearsome defensive shield is forming in the Baltic-Nordic theatre that can put an end to any of Putin's imperial dreams of empire. In fact, there's now a NATO country with a potential frontline bigger than the one in Ukraine. A place with Europe's largest wartime reserve forces, with the largest stocks of artillery in Western Europe, and a formidable geography with forests even Putin wouldn't dare to enter. It has advanced weapons such as the F-35. It can choke Putin's vital oil exports. It can cut access to Russia's critical naval ports and enclaves, and stops Vlad in his tracks in the next emerging battlefield, the Arctic. But does this all increase the likelihood of conflict with the Russian bear? What does all of this mean for the future of the continent? As Putin prepares for war against NATO, how can the Baltic Sea determine the victor? I'm Philip Ingram, and this is Battle Plans Exposed. So let's look at what's been happening in and around the Baltic and what could be influencing it. Of course, the sea battle is going to be critical, and this is the Ukraine's latest, most advanced drone, the Katran Venom, in action. We haven't seen it used in the Baltic. There's no indication that any Ukrainian technology is being used by NATO or elsewhere, but the Russians are very good at copying it. And this could be a weapon that the Russians try and copy to use against any NATO forces that are operating through this region. But we do know that Russia is building bases. It's building bases on the Russian-Finnish border. And these are satellite pictures showing those bases being built. Whether they have the equipment or the capability to actually man or put equipment into those bases is a moot point. So the Baltic is a sea, and we have the Russian Baltic Fleet, now tied in what is commonly referred to as the NATO Sea. But Russia doesn't believe it's the NATO Sea. It's still got its national right to exercise in international waters, and it carries those exercises out with its warships, trying to pretend it's more powerful than it actually is, trying to suggest it's got a naval military capability, which we've seen work embarrassingly poorly in the Black Sea. But it doesn't stop Putin putting his naval forces out, demonstrating to the Russian people that he thinks he's still powerful, demonstrating to the Russian Navy that they think they're still powerful, and NATO can sit and watch what's going on and smile. Of course, naval actions are backed by Russian strategic and tactical aircraft flying in and around this area. We've seen Russian MiG-31s stray into Estonian airspace, and reports of that. But their strategic bombers will fly out into the Baltic, usually round to the other Russian state, Kaliningrad, more of which in a moment. So if we look at Russian sovereign territory, well, Russia stops and its sea border stops here. This is the tiny little bit of the Baltic with 12 miles that it owns. To get out from St. Petersburg, to fly out through the from sovereign Russia out into the Baltic, it has got a very narrow gap between Helsinki in Finland and Tallinn in Estonia, and it is restricted in what it can maneuver before it gets into the wider Baltic Sea, which again is completely surrounded by NATO countries, with Sweden, Finland, the Baltics, Poland and Denmark further to the south. Why is this region, this body of water, so fundamentally important to Russia and to NATO? It's not just important, it's existential for Russia. Think of the Baltic Sea as Russia's economic jugular. The vast majority of Russian oil, we're talking of upwards 80%, that is exported by sea goes through the Baltic. Remember, St. Petersburg, out through this narrow gap, coming down through the Baltic and out through the tiny gaps through Denmark to get out into the Atlantic Ocean and round to the rest of the world. This source of revenue is critical for Putin's war machine, his ability to fund the war in Ukraine and his imperial ambitions. If you can disrupt that flow, you don't just hit Mad Vlad's wallet, you hit his capacity to project power. 80% is a staggering figure, So if this is Russia's economic lifeline, where are the critical points along that lifeline? What are the key Russian assets or vulnerabilities within the Baltic itself? Now you have to look at two primary non-negotiable points for Russia. First, St. Petersburg. This is not just a historic city, it's a vital port, a gateway to the world for Russian trade, particularly for oil and gas. It's the primary access point for Russia's Baltic fleet, and any threat to St. Petersburg is an immediate catastrophic threat to Russian national interests. Second, and perhaps even more provocative, is Kaliningrad. Now, Kaliningrad, ceded to Russia at the end of the Second World War, known beforehand as Königsberg, it was German territory. This is Russia's heavily militarized enclave wedged between Poland and Lithuania, bristling with advanced anti-access and area denial air defense capabilities, things like the S-400 air defense system and the Iskander ballistic missiles. From Kaliningrad, Russia can project significant military power and threaten NATO's airspace and control of vast swathes of the Baltic Sea and surrounding land. It's a thorn in NATO's side, constantly testing the alliance's resolve. How's Russia got this piece of land nestled in Europe? Well, as I mentioned, Kaliningrad was formerly known as Königsberg. It was ceded to Russia after World War II under the Potsdam Agreement, and that was agreed to give Russia access to the Baltic Sea from a port that didn't freeze during the winter. St. Petersburg will freeze, Helsinki freezes, but whenever you get a little bit further south around Kaliningrad, it doesn't freeze. So Russia has these vital economic routes and this heavily fortified outpost. This wasn't a bad setup for Putin until he made a monumental mistake. In February 2022, Putin launched the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a 2-week, or as I usually say, 10-day special military operation to seize Kyiv. This highly aggressive act led ultimately to Finland and to Sweden joining NATO by 2024. These were both neutral nations. Finland was not a NATO border with Russia. One of the reasons why Putin invaded Ukraine, he said, was to stop NATO expansion. He's just increased NATO's border with Russia significantly. This means the Baltic Sea is now completely surrounded by NATO members: Finland, Sweden, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Germany, and Denmark. A massive own goal by Putin in terms of a strategic aim, which was stopping NATO's expansion. Specifically, Sweden has an ace up its sleeve when it comes to the defence of the Baltic Sea. It's got its own permanent aircraft carrier in the middle of the Baltic Sea, influencing out Gotland Island. So why is this small island so significant in a potential conflict? Well, there are 3 reasons: location, location, and location. It's almost perfectly centred in the Baltic Sea. This means whoever controls Gotland can effectively control the air and sea lanes across the entire southern and central Baltic. And that influences directly what is coming into and out of Kaliningrad. Gotland is an unsinkable aircraft carrier for Sweden, and now, by extension, for NATO. We have to bear in mind that the Baltic states are separated from the rest of NATO by the infamous Suwałki Gap between Poland and Lithuania, but influenced by Belarus and Kaliningrad. It's a narrow land corridor that Russia, particularly if it got Belarus on side, could try and cut and link up with Kaliningrad. The only other way to resupply these countries in a conflict would be by sea and air. For NATO, Gotland acts as a forward hub for air support, for surveillance, and a staging area for reinforcements, should they be needed. It helps ensure that the vital sea lines of communication, the maritime highways for supply, remain open. The defence of Tallinn, Riga, and Vilnius hinges quite literally on the defence of Gotland and maintaining the Suwałki Gap. If Russia were to seize it, it would be a very risky move because it would stimulate an Article 5 response from NATO. They would gain a massive advantage, though, allowing them to interdict shipping, launch aircraft, and further isolate the Baltic states. For NATO, Gotland is mission critical to maintaining the freedom of navigation and power projection capability. It's a linchpin. But what about Putin's murky hybrid warfare? The war in the grey zone that blurs borders and blurs rules. This is where the threats become insidious, difficult to attribute, and potentially devastating to everyday life. We're talking about Putin's shadow fleet and the direct threat to undersea cables. This is where the lines blur and the danger escalates. Putin's shadow fleet is a clandestine network of older, often poorly maintained tankers operating under obscure flags and even with no flags, with dubious ownership. They're used to circumvent sanctions, move oil, and essentially operate outside the standard international maritime law. In the Baltic, this fleet poses a dual threat. Firstly, an environmental catastrophe. These are aging vessels, sometimes with minimal insurance, navigating busy, ecologically sensitive waters. A major incident, a spill, could be devastating. But secondly, and more ominously, they provide cover for espionage and sabotage. In a conflict, these vessels could be used for reconnaissance, for illicit transport, or even in a black operation, create a false flag incident that could be blamed on a NATO country. It's a tool for hybrid warfare, adding a layer of unpredictable chaos to an already tense environment. Intelligence sources have indicated that some of these vessels are equipped with communications gear not typically associated with cargo ships. That's not to transmit, but it's to hoover up communications from the NATO countries as they go past them. They're used to effectively map the seabed, which is the perfect way to scout for the next target, undersea critical infrastructure. On Christmas Day 2024, the Estlink 2 power cable between Finland and Estonia was cut. This was linked to a Russian oil tanker dragging its anchor. And in January this year, a Swedish-Latvian cable was severed, leading to the detention of a Russian crewed ship. This is all to disrupt financial transactions, emergency services, and public communications in a NATO state, forcing a NATO response without triggering an Article 5 military reaction. Russia is probing Europe's defences and its willingness to endure repeated attacks in the grey zone. As we've seen with recent incidents, the Kremlin is now starting to use its military to protect these illegal operations. They've flown jets to escort these tankers out of NATO's economic zones. The Shadow Fleet is no longer just a financial asset, it's a state-protected instrument that Russia is willing to fight for. So we have Russia's economic jugular, heavily fortified outposts like Kaliningrad, the critical strategic linchpin of Gotland, and now the shadowy, unpredictable fleet. It paints a picture of a region brimming with flashpoints where one misstep could have global repercussions. However, there is a country that isn't just getting ready. It spent decades building a death trap for Russia. Finland. Finland has one of Europe's most daunting national defence structures. The terrain is essentially endless forest, thousands of lakes, narrow roads, and brutal winters. Add in decades of pre-built defensive positions. They know what the Russians are like, and hidden infrastructure, and any invasion becomes a logistical nightmare. Unique in Europe, Finland can mobilise large numbers of troops quickly, 280,000. They maintained a trained wartime strength of 280,000 troops with a total reserve pool nearing 900,000, and given their small population, it's only 5.56 million strong. That is unparalleled commitment. Finland has the largest artillery capability in Western Europe, with over 1,500 major weapon systems, including howitzers, heavy mortars, and rocket launchers. This is a deep strategic stockpile built precisely to fight a long, high-intensity war, ensuring they can deliver a massive sustained volume of counter-fire should it be needed. Finland uses its terrain as a weapon. They have extensive fortifications, forests, and choke points. Their strategy, known as multi-tactics, is battle-tested from the Winter War. They don't try to hold a straight line on the border. They use the dense forests, the swamps, and extreme cold to break invading Russian columns into small, isolated pockets, or mottes, and then destroy them piecemeal. To understand the Finnish defensive mindset is to understand the Winter War in 1939 and the continuation war in 1941. This isn't theory for the Finnish people. It's a national trauma and a national lesson learned in blood. Unlike many countries that relied on external alliances, Finland has had to stand alone against the Soviet giant, not once, but twice. The most significant loss was the Karelian Isthmus, and that included Finland's second largest city, Viipuri, which is around here. Russia annexed roughly 10% of Finland's land. It wasn't just a loss of real estate. It displaced hundreds of thousands of Finns, creating a deep and lasting national memory. That loss instilled a crucial strategic principle in Finnish defence doctrine. Never again will we be caught unprepared. When they look at Russia's current war of aggression in Ukraine, annexing territory, forcibly displacing people, they don't see a historical curiosity, they see a live replay of their own history. That memory is why they maintained conscription. That memory is why they have Europe's largest wartime reserve. And that memory is why they designed their entire military to inflict the highest possible cost on any invading force and focused it on Russia. Finland's entry into NATO stabilises Northern Europe and reduces the probability of miscalculation. And now, with Finland hosting NATO exercises such as freezing winds, Putin will have to consider very carefully his moves in the Baltics. Freezing winds is highly significant because it's a Finnish-led, large-scale maritime exercise involving around 4,000 personnel from nearly every Baltic and Nordic ally. It's not just a drill, it's a demonstration that NATO is operational in all conditions and on the most sensitive waterways. So the Baltic, it's linked to what's happening elsewhere. We could see tactics from Ukraine translating into what Russia does, and it's certainly translating into what NATO does in protecting this area. But thank you once again for watching. If you want more, please subscribe to our channel. If you like what you've seen, please share it. And if you've got any comments, put them below, even ideas for future episodes. But thank you for watching. Goodbye.